Hi, I'm David Cohen, and I've been involved in the Wi-Fi industry for some time. I'm currently with a company called Gainspan Technology, and I'm sitting here with Marc Weber, also of the who is part of the Computer History Museum. And we're here to talk today to Greg Ennis, who has had a long history in wireless communications and 802.11 and Wi-Fi technology. Okay, we're going to continue with Greg. We're going to talk a little bit more about some of your early years. We talked a lot about the technology, but tell us a little bit more about yourself. What did you like to study in school? What interested you? What did you pursue, and why?
I was always a good student. I've always enjoyed learning.
Mm-hmm.
To this day, I still wish I was back in college. I would love to be a college student forever. But I figured out early that to make some money, you do need to go out and work. So as a kid, I was always interested in science and astronomy,
mm-hmm.
and I've always, as a young kid, I was good at math. I can't say I was really interested in math. But one thing to mention is that I'm a musician. I mean, from a very early age, I have been playing piano. I took classical music lessons for years. In fact, I could say this here. John Markoff, who you may know, I took piano from John Markoff's father in Palo Alto. And so I think that there's certainly a connection between music and math. I'm still a musician. I'm a jazz musician. I've played in jazz groups my entire life. I still am gigging, so that's always been part of it. And I think that ties in with my math. But I'd say I first really connected with math probably in the 7th grade. There was a program, an experimental program. It might have been developed by SRI, but Stanford Research Institute. It might have just come out of another part of Stanford, but it was called SMSG Math. I can't remember what that's, something. It was like the Stanford Mathematics Study Group or something. Mm-hmm. And it was a new curriculum for elementary school math that, remember this was back in the days of the space race, right? And we had to compete with the Russians. And so there were a lot of efforts to improve math education for elementary school students. And I remember we had these little paperback books, yellow covers, and that was just type, it wasn't typeset, it was just like Xeroxed. And what we were studying, we were doing base 7 arithmetic. As 7th graders. Somehow I doubt that they're teaching that in schools these days, but it was so radically different. This was the math, this was the new math, right? You've heard of the new math. This was the stuff where the people were complaining that the kids were coming home with their math homework and the parents had no idea what was going on. That's because we were adding 3 plus 4, that's 0, carry the 1. Of course, that ends up, translating into binary and octal and hex with computers. But back at the time, it was just an attempt to get kids to recognize that there's nothing magic about the number 10 other than the fact that we happen to have 10 fingers on our hands. And that, you could just as well do all this stuff with a different base. And I loved that stuff. And I had a tremendous math teacher back then, Mrs. Bunting, and that really got me, for the first time I think, excited about math. But then it was when I was a freshman in high school taking high school geometry, and again, I'm not sure that they do this now. I really wish they would, and I think they should. But when we were doing high school geometry back then, it was all proofs. It was all axioms. It was proving theorems. You had to prove that if you have 2 chords in a circle, that that intersect on the circumference with a diameter, you know, that's going to be a 90-degree angle. You have to prove that from the axioms. And that was totally the focus of that. We did nothing but proofs for a year. And I was really good at it, and I absolutely loved it. And then we went on to do Algebra 2 and trig, and it wasn't quite as exciting because I really loved that real proof orientation that we were taking in geometry. So then I got into Berkeley, and I started out as a physics major because that was the flashy major to major in at Berkeley. And so, of course, I took math and physics both during my first couple of years. And as I took more and more math, and we started to get to where, you know, we're focusing on proofs, we're not focusing on calculations, I came to love it again. And I quickly realized, you know, it's the math that I love here, it's not the physics, and I became a math major. And that led into, you know, the math that I ended up doing, you know, in graduate school whilst I was an undergraduate at Berkeley, was mathematical logic and set theory. You know, the book Gödel, Escher, Bach. So Gödel, you know, the type of stuff, the type of math that Gödel incompleteness, you know, that's what I concentrated in my college and graduate year math studies. So, and it still is my first love. I mean, there's no question that, you know, math is. I still read math for pleasure when I'm in bed going to sleep. You know, it's.
Do you think that has a direct tie to ultimately, you know, career in technology and wireless, or is it kind of indirect? You know?
Well, you know, I think math education is. I mean, especially as you get up to the you know, upper division math and, you know, beyond the math beyond calculus, that stuff. It's the best brain training there is. So I don't know if it's particularly, you know, I can't say that I have ever used the higher math that I learned in my graduate studies, never have used that in my technical career as an engineer. But the way to analyze a problem, the way to understand concepts, you know, I mean, that's where I think that all came and helped me as I became an engineer. Of course, I was always interested in computers, and I really shifted my focus when microprocessors came out.
What drew you to computers? Why were computers exciting at the time?
Well, so when the Adam Osborne book came out about the 8080, you know, when the Intel 8080 first came out, microprocessors first came out, and that was a revelation. I mean, I'm sure it wasn't just for me, but for a lot of people, that, you know, there's going to be some interesting stuff happening with this. And it was right around then that I then went to get a second master's degree at Stanford in computer engineering, because that really grabbed me. And plus, I saw I could probably make some money at it.
So it was after you learned about the microprocessor.
Yeah, it was when the microprocessor came out that I mean, to me, that revolutionized things for computer. The interest that I had in computer technology.
Yeah, you said you were a musician from early on, taking piano lessons and all that, and continued that through your life. Can you talk about that? You know, why did you pursue that, and why do you still pursue that? And does that tie to how does that tie to your math training, or, you know, comment on that a little bit?
Well, I mean, I pursued it because, well, I mean, for one thing, music is a beautiful pursuit, but I come from a very musical family. My grandfather was a professional violinist. He played in the St. Louis Symphony. I have a beautiful formal portrait of the St. Louis Symphony circa 1911 in the orchestra hall, you know, and there's my grandfather right there. And then my mother was like a child prodigy pianist who performed on the radio as a kid. You know, my sister is a singer, you know, so I've always, and so I started piano, and I had, you know, the best teachers, including my mother, you know. So, I played classical all through my childhood. Still do play classical, still love classical, but and then as a typical teenager back in the 60s, I became enamored with rock music, and I very quickly saw that at least as far as the piano and keyboards were concerned, there's nothing interesting going on in rock music. All the action is in jazz. And I became a jazz pianist, starting around age 19 probably. Played in bands in Berkeley when I was in college, and I've played jazz ever since.
Jazz piano?
Jazz piano.
All the way, still to this day?
Still to this day.
Oh,
yeah.
That's great. Who are some of your jazz influencers?
Oh, Chick Corea, Herbie Hancock, Keith Jarrett, Wynton Kelly, Bill Evans,
A lot of greats, yeah.
Yeah, all the greats.
Good, good. Other things that you like to do to relax and enjoy besides, reading math books at night and playing jazz? Other interests?
Well, I currently live up in the beautiful Sierra foothills where I've got an orchard and a creek through my property, and it's
Nice.
so basically, homesteading a beautiful piece of California land is a big thrill for me and my wife right now. I enjoy basketball.
Excellent, excellent, good. I think that gives us a pretty good background of your life growing up, and before you dove into all or even throughout the time that you were working in wireless. So it's good. Good, thanks. So Greg, welcome. Good to have you here. Good
Thank
to
you,
see
Dave.
you. It's been a while. We're going to start off just talking about your early years of your of your life and your career. Why don't you tell us a little bit about where you were born, where you grew up, where you studied, that kind of thing.
Well, I was actually born at Stanford University Hospital. And I grew up in Menlo Park, which is right next to the Stanford campus. In fact, the Stanford campus was essentially my playground as a kid, which was a great playground. So I went to schools in Menlo Park, went to Menlo Atherton High School in Atherton, and then I subsequently went for my undergraduate degree at UC Berkeley, where I was a math major at Berkeley.
Okay, great. And after studying math at Berkeley, where did you go on to study from there?
So I went on to pursue graduate work in math at the University of Wisconsin, and that I actually took a minor in computer science at the time. So that was, although even at Berkeley, I was taking some computer science classes. And in fact, I took Engineering 1 as a freshman, which is, we're talking about 1969 here. So we're talking about punch cards and Fortran programming. But math was my real love. And I went on to pursue further graduate work in math at the University of Wisconsin, but with a computer science minor. I was focusing on mathematical logic, actually, and set theory. So mathematical logic, I guess, has some connections to computer science. That might be what ultimately drew me to outright computer science. I ended up with a master's degree in math from the University of Wisconsin, but then I really got interested in computers, and I went to Stanford, where I got a second master's degree, this time in computer engineering. And so that was in 1979, and that was basically when I then started my career in Silicon Valley.
Okay. And what was some of your first professional stints in Silicon Valley?
So the first job I had in Silicon Valley was with a small company that was literally starting in a garage. It was a pretty nice garage, but it was a garage. It had garage doors. Company was called SciTech. It was started by a group of 5 guys who all came from Ford Aerospace, so they came out of the defense contracting world, and they were starting up a consulting and contracting company to pursue that kind of work, not just defense related, but also commercial projects as well. And so I started, as a junior engineer working for that company. I was the 9th employee, I think, by the time I left. Some years later, there were probably over 300 employees. And we did a lot of consulting work initially for government clients and for commercial clients, but ultimately the company decided to pursue product development, and in particular the products that we were developing were so-called broadband local area network products. Broadband here, back in those days, it didn't have the connotations it has today with the internet. What it really meant was using cable television technology as the underlying wired medium to support both local area network and metropolitan area network data and other applications. So I ended up at Scitech as director of engineering. So I was responsible for a lot of the product development that went along with that product line.
What kind of local area network products were being developed at that time?
So, this was back before PCs, really.
Yeah.
Well, maybe. So we're talking, 1979, very early 80s. So I guess, Apple had probably come out with their initial PCs. IBM had, that was just about the time frame when IBM was coming out with the IBM PC. But the applications for local area networks at the time, and this isn't just for what Scitech, the company I was with, what we were doing, but there were other companies, Ungram and Bass and Bridge Communications, and these companies were, actually they were all located right here near the Computer History Museum. This used to be called Land Lane over here. Scitech was on Shoreline, and I think 3Com was over here. I know Bridge was over here. So it was called Land Lane. But the applications were supporting what we would call dumb terminals, just a CRT screen with a keyboard that you would use to connect as a terminal to a computer, like a Unix computer or a VAX, a larger computer somewhere. And the real market for this stuff was that if you think of a university campus or a military base or some kind of a large installation like that, you would typically want to be able to connect to multiple computers. And the way that people had to do that previously was you'd have to have a terminal that would connect you to this computer, and another terminal that would connect you to this computer, another terminal, and this would all be on your desk. So instead, people wanted to have a single computer, and you would be able to connect to multiple computers. And that's what the local area network technology did, that Scitech developed, and then other companies were pursuing this as well. That would basically be a box that would connect to the cable network wires, and then you would plug the terminal into that, and through a command interface to that box, you would be able to command it to connect you over here, and then you'd do your session to that computer, and then when you're done with that, you would connect over here. So those were really the initial applications of local area network technology. Then, of course, the personal computer came out, and now it's a totally different ball game, because now you've got, you want to be doing file sharing, you want to not just be connecting from a dumb terminal to bigger computers, you want to be connecting between PCs and the file servers. This was right when 3Com really got started with their products that were focused on local network, Ethernet applications for.
So what time frame is this about? Mid-1980s?
Talking early 1980s.
Okay.
Early 1980s. And Scitech actually got the contract from IBM to develop a local area network product line for the IBM PC. It's called PC Network, and that was actually where NetBIOS came out of that particular effort. I was very involved in the development of that. And so Scitech ended up being a contractor to IBM developing this network for the IBM personal computer product family. Ended up not being a huge success in the market because another division of IBM was developing token ring technology, and there was an internal IBM battle, but that's another story.
Well, great. How did that, so, what happened from there? Obviously, you got some interest and a lot of hands-on development experience with local area networking technology. So, where did that kind of LAN technology take you next?
Well, I started my own consulting business in 1989, and that consulting business, it basically was just a single person. It's not like I had a bunch of staff. Yeah. I just operated as an independent consultant, and I had through the 90s. A wide variety of consulting clients in all sorts of different technology areas. I got involved in some very interesting technology. For example, I was one of the system architects for one of the early wireless airplane phone systems. You still see these sometimes on commercial jets. In fact, I saw one just the other day where the phone was in front of it, and then they had a sign on it saying "not operational," because those things haven't been operational for years. But back at the time, that was a real service that was being provided to passengers of commercial airlines, and so it involved a tremendous integration of all sorts of different technologies to connect the phones within the planes, plus all the wireless technologies to connect down to the ground station, the development of all the base stations, et cetera. So I was a system architect on a project like that. That was just an example of one of the projects. I did a lot of projects continuing to involve cable television technology, to providing voice services over cable systems, providing meter reading services over cable systems, doing products that today we would call cable modems, although at the time, we wouldn't call those cable modems. But what's interesting, when I think back on the connection between those projects and my subsequent Wi-Fi and wireless experiences, cable systems really use radio technology. I mean, when you're transmitting data over a cable system, over a CATV system, it's really a wire a radio that you're using. You're using radio frequency transmission. We would call them radios. It's just that the radio waves are constrained to go simply over the cable system rather than broadcast out into the airwaves.
Essentially RF over coax.
It's RF over coax.
Yeah.
Yeah, so in practice, much of my career, even though I can't say that in my early days I was necessarily focused on wireless, I was certainly focused on RF. And in particular, I was focused in providing communication services, data communication services, using radios, and all the issues that come to bear with that type of technology, even though at the time it wasn't strictly wireless. But then, as part of my consulting work, I started to get involved in some specific wireless projects.
Yeah, what were some of the first projects you got involved in that were specifically wireless, as in non-wire?
So I think there were some miscellaneous things, but the first one that I think is probably significant here, it was a project for the Chicago Board of Trade and the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. And so again, we're talking, this is probably around 1991, something like that. Yeah, probably maybe 1990. And what had happened was that the trading floors, these are the big commodity exchanges in Chicago. And the trading floors at the time were completely manual. People, they actually would, the traders would be shouting at each other across the trading pits to decide to make a trade, and they would be writing something down on a card. It was amazing. I took a tour of this. That was part of the project here. And these traders would literally throw a card down on the floor, and there would be runners with color-coded jackets who would come up and pick up those cards. And then they would go into a back room, and they would try to match these cards up, and come up with what the trade was that these two traders had actually agreed upon, and that was ripe for fraud. And there was actually an SEC sting operation at I think it was at both the Chicago Board of Trade and the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. And the SEC demanded of those exchanges that they automate their operations and computerize them.
Because of significant fraud that
because
was
of
occurring?
Fraud.
Okay.
And so we got, it was a consulting contract that, I was working with other people on this. We got a contract to develop a wireless handheld trading terminal. This is 1991. Basically this terminal, it was also going to have a graphic display and a touchpad. They wanted it to emulate as close as possible these physical cards that that the traders were doing. But my responsibility was doing the architecture of that wireless network. I had previously had experience designing protocol architectures for a variety of different underlying mediums, including radios over cable systems, like I talked about. So it wasn't a huge stretch for me to be involved in the design of these wireless protocols to support these trading terminals. But we were talking about probably 1,000 trading terminals on a floor, and having base stations, et cetera. And so that experience of designing a protocol architecture for that wireless trading terminal system for the Chicago Board of Trade, that ultimately led to the projects that I got involved in that eventually became Wi-Fi.
Yeah, Greg, when you say protocol architecture, are you talking about something that is similar in concept to the ultimately the 802.11 networking layers, like you got involved in? How would the physical layer be like? What would the medium access control layer be like? For this Chicago Board of Trade, Chicago Mercantile Exchange system.
Right, exactly right. It would be the what's called the access method for the radio system, so that the devices can fairly share the airwaves bandwidth among each other, and also for the reliability of the communications, to make sure that packets as they're generated get addressed and delivered to the right recipient, and that there's acknowledgments. All those aspects of the protocol, back in the 1991 timeframe, there were no standards for wireless at this time for this type of a system, so it would be a proprietary design that I'd be developing. But ultimately, the standards effort started up within IEEE to develop multi-vendor standards so that multiple manufacturers could develop this stuff and all work together.
So what were some of the other companies that were developing, pre-standard, developing some of these wireless access, wireless local area networking access systems? Were there others that were competing for the Chicago Mercantile Exchange business, or other major projects that were going on that you're aware of?
Yes, so there was a company called Proxim, who they were very early on in this, and the company that I ultimately ended up consulting for was a company called Symbol Technologies. They have since been merged in with Motorola. But Symbol is in well, back then they were in the business of providing handheld barcode scanners for inventory applications and for warehousing applications, for retail applications, where people could go around and scan barcodes. I think Symbol had some of the fundamental patents on barcode technology. That's how they got into this, and then they developed these wireless handheld terminals. So Symbol was definitely already starting to do this wireless local area network type technology. And another company that was very early here was NCR. Again, same type of applications that NCR was looking at, these vertical market applications for warehousing and for barcode scanning and this kind of thing. And I started consulting for Symbol Technologies. In fact, we ended up working jointly with NCR in developing some stuff that ultimately became the IEEE standard.
Okay. Well, okay. Sure.
And were there any that you took as models when you did the system for the Chicago trading floor?
Well, so not so much on the wireless side. I had done protocol design, and I was working with other people on those projects who came from SciTech, which was the company that I worked with originally out of Stanford, where we had done these metropolitan cable systems and projects like that. So we all kind of came out of a background of knowing how to do proprietary architectures for advanced networks. And so the wireless application that we had for the Chicago Board of Trade, although there was nothing that we really could look at that was anything like that, I think the group of people working on this, we had the kind of experience to pull that together.
Yeah, just a clarification question. So how many of you were working on that Chicago Mercantile Exchange Board of Trade wireless protocol?
So there were, there was probably a core group of about 3 of us who were really doing the architecture of those protocols. But that project, as you can imagine, involved a lot of other, there was the actual physical hardware design for the trading terminal. There was a company called Cinerdyne in Southern California that was actually developing this handheld trading terminal, and yeah, there were a lot of, there were other people, but I'd say as far as the core architecture of the wireless network, it was me, and then there were a couple of other guys who were instrumental in that.
Okay, so now we get to the point where you're working at Symbol, and you've got NCR also working on these vertical inventory, barcode scanning, wireless applications. Talk a little bit, if you can, about how that developed, matured, and how that ultimately led to the standardization effort.
So so Symbol and NCR were bitter competitors. There was a guy, one of the head guys at Symbol, who used to describe them as compestitors or something, trying to combine competitor and customer, because they also sold stuff to each other. And so right in that early 90s time frame, an effort did start up within IEEE to be IEEE 802.11. There was the IEEE 802.11 committee. And that committee was starting to come up with general requirements and kind of some basic ideas. I started participating in that, I believe, in 1991, and the guys from NCR were participating in that, and we ended up seeing that there were some real philosophy similarities in the way that both NCR and Symbol wanted to approach a wireless local area network, as opposed to the philosophies or the architectures that some other proponents were putting forward, in particular IBM. IBM had put together a concept that was a very centralized system. And so there were these competing proposals that kind of took a radically different approach. And it turned out that the NCR approach and the symbol approach were compatible. And so we decided, let's put together a joint proposal. And we started working, in particular, I started working very closely with one person at NCR named Wim Diepstraten, who was, one of their main architects. This was a group at NCR based in Holland. They subsequently got sold to Lucent, and they're a major player through this whole story.
That's right.
But I started working with Wim Diepstraten on the development of a joint proposal that we could potentially put in front of the IEEE 802.11 group. I had had previous experience back in my SciTech days. I chaired a subcommittee of the Ethernet group of 802.3 on broadband Ethernet. And so I had some experience on, politically, what's the best way to achieve what you might want to achieve within the IEEE committees. And I knew it really works out well if you can get multiple companies behind a single proposal and put that in front of the group and then start to get momentum. I think that's pretty much the standard way that this happens these days within IEEE. But so we recognized that working together between Symbol and NCR would be a good thing to put together a joint proposal. And then, this is almost a personal thing. There was a third company that joined us, and that company was Zircom. And the reason why I say this is personal is that at SciTech, my boss, a guy named Ken Biba, he was now I don't know if he was the CEO or what his position was at Zircom, but he was at Zircom, and they were starting to develop wireless LAN technology as well. So, I knew Ken from years. He had a third, a guy working for him named Phil Bellinger. And Phil I had previously met many years ago when he was at Corvus just doing local area network development. And so ultimately, Phil and Wim and I put together a joint proposal for really the fundamental architecture of what we felt the 802.11 standard should be for the MAC protocol, the medium access control layer, which supports multiple different physical layers, but all uniformly there's this one medium access control layer that is kind of the top level architecture of everything.
Yeah, so to recap, it was Zircom, Symbol, and NCR joining together.
That's right. And actually the proposal that we put together, it was called DFW MAC. And the acronym, we said this stood for Distributed Foundation Wireless Local or Medium Access Control. Distributed Foundation Wireless Medium Access Control, DFW MAC. But we came up with the acronym after, we came up with what that stood for after we came up with the acronym. Because at one of the IEEE committees, one of the chairs of one of the subgroups, when we ended one of the meetings, he said his fondest hope is that the proponents of these different proposals would happen to meet on their way home at DFW Airport, and they would get together over a beer and put together a joint proposal that they could bring in. And so we decided we've got to call this protocol DFW MAC. And then after we came up with that, we decided, okay, so what can that really mean? Okay, it's a distributed foundation wireless medium access control. So, but the DFW MAC proposal ultimately won out over the IBM proposal. There was a proposal from National Semiconductor. You know, there were other competing proposals that had been put forward. And in November of 1993, our proposal ended up getting adopted by the 802.11 committee as the foundation for the standard. And then the real development of the specification took off from there, ultimately leading to the publishing of the standard in 1997.
Now, how come it took 4 years to go from the basic agreed framework of the MAC layer, the medium access control layer, to to the publication of the standard? And how involved were you at that time?
So as soon as the DFW MAC proposal was adopted, and now people, we all had a course in front of us for how to develop this. I became the technical editor of the 802.11 committee. So I was very involved in the actual writing of that text that ultimately became the specification. But there was, a lot of details that needed to be worked out. There was also still a tremendous amount of work happening at the physical level. At the time, there were 3 different physical levels. There was a radio based on direct sequence technology. There was a different radio approach based on frequency hopping technology, and then there was an infrared approach. Those were the 3 kind of different modes of operation within the original IEEE 802.11 standard. Ultimately, it was just the direct sequence one that ended up taking off commercially and becoming what we now know as Wi-Fi. But so there was a lot of work going on at that level as well to finalize the standard.
So 3 different physical layers, but one MAC layer, one medium access control.
One medium access control port.
And you were editing both, or
I was editing the MAC.
Okay.
Well, no, actually that's not true. I was editing the whole document. There were sub-editors who were contributing different sections. I was working on the entire document. There's another, Bob O'Hara was also, he and I were co-editors on that.
Yeah, now you mentioned, of course, rightly so, that direct sequence ultimately became the PHY layer that ultimately became, a big part of what we know today as Wi-Fi. But weren't there a lot of frequency hopping implementations at the time as well?
There were, and it's still a very viable technology. It's the basic technology in Bluetooth, for example, although that's separate from the 802.11 stuff. But I think what ultimately happened was once the initial standard came out, and the data rate at the time in the initial standard was 2 megabits a second. Perfect for handheld warehouse and inventory control applications. Not so good for office applications. And so people saw that, if we can get the speed up to where we can support data rates that are similar to Ethernet, 10 megabits per second. Of course, Ethernet at the time, you had 100 megabit per second capability coming out, but still people viewed the 10 megabit per second threshold as what was required to really support office applications with wireless. And so there were a number of design approaches that people were coming up with to try to reach that speed threshold. And ultimately, it turned out that it was the direct sequence technology that, rather than the frequency hopping technology, that lended itself better to evolving towards higher and higher data rates. And I think that's ultimately what made the direct sequence technology the one that ultimately evolved into Wi-Fi.
Right, but at the time of the 1997 standard, you had both frequency hopping and direct sequence commercialized products for barcode scanning and other applications, both at 2 megabits per second.
Yes,
right? Okay.
That's right.
Right, and then when the standards committee wanted to look at, as you said, increasing that speed to something that was a similar speed to 10 megabit Ethernet, that's when the direct sequence, the focus became more on the direct sequence approach.
That's right. And so I was involved with, so that ended up being 802.11b, which was a a new specification for a new physical layer within 802.11. Same medium access protocol, same MAC, but now at an 11 megabit rate. But there were, before the 802.11b approach was finalized within IEEE, there, similar to the earlier efforts, there were competing proposals that people put forward. And actually I was consulting for 3Com at the time and working on some projects for 3Com to do exactly that, to achieve the 10 megabit per second rate and to try to address the personal computer market, the office application market, and hit that Ethernet speed.
That's right. Yeah.
And before 1997, can you just give a brief thumbnail of who was actually using wireless networking at the time and in what industries?
Before 1997,
around 97.
Yeah, it was very much a vertical market. It was these warehouses. For example, one of the early applications of this technology was for the car rental companies. When you go up to a car rental company and they have their remote wireless terminal where they're checking you in, that stuff got started to be introduced, back in those time frames, and it was originally proprietary networks. There was a company called Telzon that was developing a competitor to Symbol and to NCR that was developing products like that. Things like UPS. I don't know specifically that UPS. I mean, they certainly, not much later than that started to have systems like this. But so it's for those kinds of, what we'd call vertical market applications in the wireless industry, as opposed to the broad horizontal market that everybody ultimately wanted to go after, which was, putting it into laptops and into PC cards that would plug into laptops and putting it into people's homes and offices for standard office type applications. Remember, this is really before the internet was big. That's another thing to keep in mind. We're talking about the early 90s. We were just starting to see the beginnings of browser technology and web. I mean, it was the internet. You could do email, you could do file transfers, but we weren't doing web browsing. It wasn't the web. That technology was being developed really at the same time that we're talking about this wireless technology being developed. And so those types of applications, the horizontal applications for internet access, for office stuff, really wasn't going on in the wireless industry back then.
And 97, that was still the case.
97, that was still the case. That's right.
Yeah. And so you were doing some consulting at 3Com, which I know because that's when I met you, when I was working at 3Com. And so 3Com's, consulting direction to you was to do exactly what regarding the standard.
So 3Com at the time, they were the dominant local area network manufacturer. Very, very successful, selling plug-in cards for PCs, IBM PCs, and so they saw wireless as an obvious next step for their traditional markets. I mean, they were definitely into that horizontal market for their wired Ethernet local area network technology, and they wanted to get into that for their for wireless. And 3Com had an internal project to try to develop a wireless technology that would cross that magic 10 megabit per second threshold. And I was initially brought in by a person that I had known previously, Jeff Abramowitz, who was at 3Com, to help evaluate this internal technology and to determine if that's something that we potentially could put forward to IEEE as a proposal for a higher data rate standard that would that could could be adopted by IEEE. And so that was my initial task, and as a result of that project, I think we all came to the conclusion that there are other approaches that people are talking about out there, and we need to look at those, because at the same time, IEEE 802.11, the Wireless LAN Committee, they had started up a project called 802.11b to come up with a higher data rate version of the standard. And there were proposals, most notably coming in from a company called Harris, which was a major semiconductor manufacturer producing semiconductors for wireless local area networks. And then another proposal coming in from Lucent, which was really NCR. I mean, Lucent had bought the division of NCR in Holland that we were talking about earlier in the 1993 timeframe. And so there were these other proposals for 10 megabit per second speeds in wireless LANs.
Was that the agreed upon goal in the 11B committee? 10 meg, was it a formal or informal goal to reach a 10 megabit barrier?
I think it was a formal goal. Within IEEE, there's a project authorization request that a particular effort needs to be to get authorized to do work. I'd have to go back and check that, but this 802.11b was called the high rate standard, and I suspect that 10 megabits was built right into that project authorization.
I guess formally
request.
or informally, everyone acknowledged that that's the goal to reach.
That was definitely the goal. Yeah. So my work at 3Com changed to really evaluating some of these other proposals that were being put forward within the IEEE committee to try to see if partnering with one of those companies would make sense for 3Com. And so as part of that, I started to represent 3Com on the IEEE 802.11 committee and to start to work with these other companies on seeing what we could do to come up with a standard there.
Yeah, now so you mentioned there are basically two I guess the 3Com specific proposal was abandoned at some point. And there were two major proposals, one from Harris and one from what was then Lucent.
Right.
After being acquired, after NCR was acquired. Can you describe roughly the two different approaches and what the differences were?
So it was differences in the modulation technique that was being looked at, and the encoding technique for the physical layer of the radios. Both approaches did not require any change to the MAC protocol, and so it was really focused on how the bits really are signaled over the airwaves, and it almost got into religious wars. There were other proposals as well. It wasn't just those two, but those were the two big ones, and ultimately it was the Harris technology that with some modifications, as a result of all of the discussions. But ultimately, it was the Harris technology that got adopted within IEEE for the 802.11b.
Sure. Can you tell us about some of these, passionate, religious wars and some of the fun stories that may have ensued, during these standards battles of, no, it should be my proposal, no, my proposal, and talk about both, maybe some of the drama that played out as well as the, the technical arguments that were going on, to the extent you can remember.
Yeah, so I'm not sure I can necessarily remember the exact detail here, but there was a very dramatic moment in one of the IEEE meetings in the development of the, working towards the selection of an approach for 802.11b, where on one of the critical votes, there ended up being accusations of block voting. So IEEE, the way IEEE operates is it's an organization of individual engineers. Obviously, everybody is there. They're working for their individual companies, and they in practice, people bring in their own biases based upon the companies that they work for. But formally, the IEEE is a committee of individual engineers, and organizing all of your employees to vote a particular way within IEEE, that's a real no-no. And evidence of that, if it can be brought forward, is a severe problem. And there were accusations on one particular vote of block voting. I remember that created quite a disruption in the process.
Was one proposal about to win, or was it just an accusation that was leveled that had to be dealt with?
I don't recall the specifics there. But I mean, we could go back and look at the minutes.
The meeting minutes, yeah.
This would have been probably in early 1999, I would suspect, maybe, probably 1998, I would think.
So you mentioned the Harris proposal eventually won out. Do you have you recall any sense for why ultimately that one got enough favor? Because just for everyone to understand, it has to get a certain amount of votes from all the individial members.
Yeah,
so at some point, some votes had to be swayed, I suppose, if it were previously deadlocked. So.
Yeah, I think there were. I don't remember the details of that. I do recall that ultimately in my work at 3Com, working with the people at 3Com, that we decided that it was the Harris proposal that seemed to be the best technical fit for what 3Com wanted to do. And so, that I know that was discussions that we had as part of my effort there. But I don't know what other people, but ultimately the Harris approach did end up getting selected.
Great. Okay. Well, what happened, and from your recollection, what happened next? Everyone voted for the Harris proposal, and then, when was the 11B amendment officially published?
Yeah. So the 11B amendment was officially published in 1999, and so there was an effort that had started up that was a competing effort to the IEEE efforts that was called HomeRF. And HomeRF was there were a number of companies involved in that. Intel was in there. Proxim was very influential within HomeRF. And their goal was to develop some kind of a standard multi-vendor radio technology that could be used not just to support local area network applications, but also to support voice applications. So their concept was that this was going to be kind of a universal network, wireless network within the home that would support cordless phones and also file transfers. And there was a particular technology that they were pursuing for that. And that was different from IEEE. And it was not being put forward within IEEE as a potential standard. And it was really potentially a threat to all of the companies who had been focused on having this true international standard come out of the IEEE efforts. And so I was also consulting for Symbol Technologies at the time, and with Symbol Technologies, I was asked to participate in the HomeRF efforts. And there were separate meetings going on to develop things. And of course, I was still very actively involved in IEEE. And my task was to try to convince HomeRF that for the higher speed version of what they were doing, that they should adopt 802.11b. And I gave a proposal, I gave a presentation at a HomeRF meeting on this, and was essentially told, no, we're too far along, no, that won't work, and besides the IEEE 802.11 stuff is way too complicated, and it's too costly, and it'll never fly in the market, and all these types of things. And there were, at that meeting, other representatives from Symbol. There was a representative from Harris. There was a representative from 3Com. As I recall, we ended up going out and having sushi in Vancouver during this home RF meeting. All of us, so
I think it's okay to say who it is, you know.
so it was David Cohen from 3Com, and Jim Zirin from Harris, and then I believe that Sarosh Vasuna was probably there from Symbol,
Yeah.
and me. It might have been only three of us.
I think it was three of us at the sushi,
Yeah,
if I recall that.
And you know, so we were all, you know, proponents of IEEE 802.11b at this point, and we decided, you know, we can do what Home RF is trying to do here. We need to form an organization that will certify interoperability of 802.11b products, and so that we can prove to everybody that this stuff can be implemented in a multi-vendor way that everybody can build, and that was the genesis, at least in my recollection,
Sure.
of what ultimately became the Wi-Fi Alliance.
Right, right. So Greg, talk a little bit, you know, we've talked about some of the standards bodies and some of the players, you know, Harris, Symbol, you know, Proxim in another camp and all that, NCR, 18, Lucent, all that. Talk a little bit about, you know, the complexities involved in doing a wireless local area network, the 802.11 effort, because, you know, this is certainly a challenge beyond wired local area networking.
Absolutely, and in fact, there were many naysayers as this effort was progressing, saying that this is, you know, it's just not going to be possible to really come up with a standard here that people will be able to implement and that they'll be able to interoperate with each other, because it's just too complicated. You know, the 802.11 spec, just the original 1997 802.11 spec, you know, ended up being that thick, you know, whereas the original Ethernet specification, you know, was like that. Even though, you know, we used to call it the 802.11 stuff wireless Ethernet. Well, why is it so much thicker and more complicated? Well, that's because it's wireless. So you have issues. I mean, for one thing, just the communication medium, it's much more difficult to communicate a bit from point A to point B when you've got all sorts of interference going on, when you've got competing users. Remember, this technology is operating in unlicensed bands. And that was one of the
What does that mean for?
Yeah, so that was one of the real instigating factors that kind of led to the proliferation of this technology originally. So the FCC in the United States and other regulatory authorities in other parts of the world, they're responsible for coming up with the basic rules for how equipment can transmit over the airwaves using radios. And some of the bands that the FCC regulates are called licensed bands, which means that you actually have to pay money to get a license for a particular set of frequencies within a particular geographic area, and nobody else can use that frequency in that area. So
Like a TV station, for example.
like a TV station, like cell phones. I mean, cell phones today, you know, the different cellular operators, they have licenses for specific frequencies in specific geographic regions, and it's only their equipment that can be using those frequencies. So in that type of an environment, now you're in pretty good control. It's still a challenging environment as far as you know, just transmitting over the airwaves as opposed to having a nice clean wire that you're transmitting over. But at least you're not putting up with interferers that are competing in the same frequencies. So in contrast, the wireless LAN technology was authorized by the FCC, and the same thing in other parts of the world, to operate in unlicensed bands, which means that a user doesn't have to go out and get a license from the FCC. That's why, you know, today you can go out and and buy a laptop and it's got or a smartphone and it's got Wi-Fi in there, and there's nothing that you needed to do in order to obtain that license, or the provider of that smartphone actually. But the complication is that means there can be interferers in there. There can be other users of those same frequencies in the same geographic region who are competing for that same bandwidth. Mm-hmm. And so the protocol, and this really comes down to some of the complications that go into the medium access protocol, which was the original proposal we did back in '93. You have to do things in order to operate effectively even in the presence of interfering users. Mm-hmm. So that means you have to have the built-in acknowledgements. See, like Ethernet doesn't even bother with built-in acknowledgements. It relies on higher level protocols to handle that level of reliability, because the wire itself is just so reliable.
Yes, essentially you have two challenges. One is you don't have a wire, so the medium is a little less certain, and also, like you mentioned, you don't have license control over that particular spectrum. You also have to deal with an unknown number of other devices in that spectrum.
Yeah, that's right.
So talk a little bit about how the standard dealt with that challenge.
So, first the underlying physical radios would be designed to be able to operate in that environment. But at the medium access level, the protocol would be designed to this is similar to Ethernet, although it operates differently, to sense whether there's other another transmission going on, and to not transmit if it's sensing that. But then also there's built into the protocol for this stuff, as it ultimately became standardized, is something called collision avoidance. Mm-hmm. I would say Wim Diepstraten from NCR, he was one of the main developers of some of these concepts, that would, before you start transmitting, there's actually a mechanism built into it so that if one of your peers might want to be transmitting at the same time, you would kind of randomize your start of transmission. So that was built into the protocol, but then also built-in acknowledgements, which at the time in the 802 family of standards, having acknowledgements built right into the 802 standard was typically thought of as not necessary.
What does an acknowledgement actually do?
So it makes sure that a transmitter gets a positive feedback that the receiver actually received that packet. So that's built in there. But then in addition, there's other vagaries of the wireless environment that make things complicated. So for example, you could have a station over there trying to communicate with somebody over here, and another station over here that's also trying to communicate. And these two stations are so far away from each other that even though they're trying to communicate with the same guy, they can't hear each other. Mm-hmm. And so there's complications in the protocol to be able to deal with making sure that these transmitters don't step on each other, even though they can't hear each other. Mm. And that involves something that actually there was the Zircom contribution into the joint proposal that we ended up putting out, dealt with that. That's the so-called hidden terminal problem. Mm-hmm. But then in addition, there's roaming issues. I mean, in a wired environment, a device doesn't typically roam from one location to another, whereas in the wireless environment, I mean, that's the whole point. And in fact, you can roam from you're connected to one access point that's giving you access to the rest of the network, and you could roam and connect to another one without losing your connectivity. So all of those mechanisms in order to deal with roaming. I mean, that's another complication of a wireless environment that you don't have within the wired environment. So that's why that that document became so thick because it had to deal with all these issues of the wireless environment. Mm-hmm. Security is another reason, right? Security is way more of an issue within a wireless environment than it is within a wired network. So there's security mechanisms that get built right into the standard that weren't viewed as necessary for Ethernet, for example. But so we ended up with a very thick specification, and because of that, people were skeptical that we would be able to have independently developed implementations really interoperate, just because it's such a complicated specification. The people figured, it'll never work. People are going to interpret the spec differently, and that's why ultimately we started the Wi-Fi Alliance, to make sure that everything interoperated properly.
Sure. Yeah, we'll talk more about that soon. Is it possible to talk, without getting really lost in the technical details, to talk about how the standard dealt with some of those issues, like, for example, the hidden terminal problem? What was it in the standard that helped resolve that? Is it possible to give kind of a high-level explanation of that resolution?
Yeah. So there in the original standard, and this is basically the MAC protocol, although it's had some evolution. Today we're basically using the exact same MAC protocol
the existing,
that we came out with
the 97,
in the
802.11 MAC.
There's an optional packet exchange that stations can do. It's called an RTS and a CTS packet.
And that stands for?
Well, it comes actually from the old RS-232 days of that you plug. And now we're going way back. RS-232 is the wired connector standard for connecting a dumb terminal to a local area network back in the 80s, or connecting a terminal to a modem. Yeah. And there's multiple signals within those wires, and one of them is called RTS, that stands for request to send, and the other one is called CTS, that's clear to send. And there's a part of the RS-232 mechanism. There's a little handshake that goes on so that the transmitting side doesn't send something that the receiving side isn't ready to receive. And so this was really a play on words to call these packets RTS, CTS, because it was a little handshake. But basically, the way that it would work, this was for communication, for example, to an access point. And you'd have a one station that's over here and another station that's way over here, and they don't hear each other, but the access point hears both of them. And so basically the way this would work would be if a station had a packet to send, it would send an RTS packet first, very short little packet, to the access point, and within that packet would be an indication of how big the packet was that he wanted to eventually send. And the access point would retransmit that out as what's called a CTS, still including that information in there saying how big the packet is that this guy wants to transmit. And since that's being transmitted from the access point, that would be heard by everybody, even if they can't hear themselves. So this station over here it may want to transmit something, but it first sees a CTS coming in from the access point that indicates to it that there's some other station that wants to transmit a packet this big. And so what it's going to do, it's going to wait for that period of time until it knows that other packet got transmitted. Right. So I simplified it a bit, but that's basically the idea.
No, it makes a lot of sense. The second station can hear the CTS packet, but it didn't know originally that the other station existed.
That's right.
Yeah. What about roaming? Like, say, the part of the whole point in wireless is roaming, and if you have to be stationary, you've kind of defeated the purpose. You might as well use a wired network. So, can you similarly give maybe just a high-level overview of how the roaming handoff worked, or was it borrowed from another concept, or how did that get developed in the original 802.11 MAC?
Yeah. So the kind of the standard configuration for for Wi-Fi these days, and this is true, way back in the earlier days, was where you have some kind of a wired network already installed within an office environment or a factory floor or whatever. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to add these wireless devices to that environment, to connect them into the wired environment. And the way that you would do that would be to have these special devices called access points that would connect to the wired network directly, like through Ethernet. They would have you still have these in your homes. You have access points that have a Ethernet connection to your DSL modem. But these attach to the wired network, and then they serve as the wireless access point. That's why they're called access points for all the wireless devices to connect to. But in a large facility, you like a factory or a big office complex, you would have multiple of these access points, because the radios can only transmit, say 100 meters. It depends on the thickness of the walls and all of that. But so you'd have multiple access points, and people would potentially be roaming. So built into the protocol, and this is another big difference between what we had to do for the wireless standards versus what happens in, say, Ethernet. Built into the protocol is this notion of a station associating with a particular access point, and then using that access point while it's within range of that access point. But if you roam to where you're starting to get a better signal from another access point, it would be better for you to switch your association from this access point here to that one, because you'll have better performance. And so, not only is there this handshake to actually achieve the association, but there's mechanisms built into the protocol to be doing background scanning of the environment, so you can sense, I'm currently connected to this access point, but guess what? On another frequency channel in my background scan that I did when I wasn't transmitting any data here, I've detected that there's another access point that actually has a stronger signal, and so I'm going to reassociate now with that access point. So all that mechanism, the scanning, the determination of what the best access point is, the actual association with the access point, that also impacted the thickness of that ultimate specification.
Yeah.
Was there much cross-fertilization with the telecom world, like GSM and CDMA? Some of the issues you're talking about have certainly analogs there.
Right. So there was, and certainly some of these ideas aren't unique to the wireless environment for the wireless LANs. So there certainly was cross-fertilization. I would say in those days, though, the people participating, there was the telecom world, and remember, even in those days, cell phones weren't as prevalent as they are now. So there was obviously work going on in that world. There was work going on in the local area network world that really came out of the LAN efforts that didn't have necessarily strong ties with the telecom world. So there was some separation, but everybody involved in this, everybody's engineers, you all keep up on what's going on in all sorts of aspects of technology. So there certainly was cross-fertilization, but I think, and today there's tremendous cross-fertilization because, Wi-Fi is incorporated in all the smartphones, and the big wireless operators are all also the big hotspot operators, and there's a tremendous cross-fertilization. But back then it was, there was some separation.
Yeah. So one last, I guess, quasi-technical question. And there's many chapters to this, but you mentioned that compared to a wired network and wireless, you have to be concerned about security. Just if you could briefly explain, it feels right, but explain a little bit about why that's so on a wireless network, and what were some of the early efforts to address security.
Sure. So if you think about a wired environment in an office, let's say Ethernet, where you've got all your computer terminals, or your, back then, or then later your PCs, and that, all your servers and everything. Of course, today it would all be Wi-Fi, but let's take a wired environment with Ethernet. So with that type of an installation, the only way somebody could tap into the network to obtain the data and to snoop and to compromise the privacy and the security of your data going on in that network, the only way they'd be able to do that would be to actually enter the building and to put some kind of a snooping device on one of the actual connections to your wired network. And typically an office installation, you would prevent that by not letting just a random person come into your office.
Sure.
You would have locked doors. And you would assume that if the person can't get into the facility, they're not going to be able to compromise my data. And so consequently, back in the 90s, a wired network would typically not be encrypted at all. It wouldn't have any special security. You'd have passwords on a file server or whatever, but as far as encrypting the actual data, that typically wasn't viewed as a real strong requirement. Wireless goes through walls. Somebody can park a truck out in the parking lot and conceivably could snoop on your traffic without having access to your physical security. So that's why the base standard of 802.11 incorporated encryption. It was actually called Wired Equivalent Privacy, WEP. And the meaning of that is that this should provide the same level of privacy protection as you get from an unencrypted wired network that is protected by physical security mechanisms like locks on the doors and things like that. And so that was the initial encryption mechanism that was put into the 802.11 standard right from the start.
Great. Yeah, and all that, as we said earlier, got incorporated in 802.11b also, where the MAC layer is staying the same.
And went through significant evolution.
Right, which we'll talk about probably a little bit later. We left off, we were talking about the standard got developed, and then we realized that maybe we needed something more than just the standards body. The standard was great, a lot of great intelligence went into it, but we realized maybe we needed something more to promote the standard and get some promotion behind the standard, ensure interoperability and all that. And I think there were a couple of events that led up to it, and we were just talking about one of them. At one point, I think you as a consultant for Symbol, me as an employee for 3Com, Jim Zirin as a employee for Harris Semiconductor, went down to the Home RF meeting, the other standard that was bubbling around, to see if we could merge efforts and see if we can get them to adopt their version 2 as IEEE 802.11b, so we'd have a nice kind of merger and harmony. So that was our mission anyway. What happened at the meeting from what you recall, Greg?
We were shot down.
Succinctly put.
Yeah, and I don't think it was for technical reasons. So I gave a presentation, I recall, that went through what the IEEE 802.11b high rate standard was all about, and trying to convince them that this made sense for Home RF as their next generation standard as well. Like you said, so everything would converge. But I think they were already pretty far along on developing a specification for their next generation stuff, and they were expressing, I think, the typical concerns that many people had, which was, the IEEE specification is way too complicated. It's not going to end up allowing products to really interoperate because it's going to be so difficult to implement. It's going to be really costly. and it's just not going to work. And we need something that's more closely focused on our specific requirements, which included this voice support requirement.
Right.
And they basically said, we're going to continue on our path, and you guys can do what you want.
Yeah, here's the door. I remember some of it. I remember as you went over a very detailed, technical presentation. I thought there might be like a counter technical, presentation. There wasn't. It was like,
Right.
thanks for coming.
Right.
And to your point, they had some legitimate concerns, I think, in terms of at least the perceived complexity. The fact that they wanted to make it voice oriented, and IEEE 802.11b at the time wasn't necessarily voice oriented. Those quality of service enhancements, came later. So, I think it was a good effort, but they didn't really want to adopt our proposal.
And I think they did have legitimate concerns about the ability to, for multiple independent implementations to be done and to interoperate.
Right.
And
right.
so that was really the fundamental problem I think we needed to solve at that point in order for this standard to be successful.
Yeah, and I think they're right about that. And for Home RF, they were basically, essentially taking one company's Proxim's technology, and so they didn't have to worry about interoperability as much, But then again, it wasn't an open standard,
Right.
necessarily, like an IEEE standard. So, yeah, I think that, after that meeting, we realized there was going to be no intersection. I think that was when we sat down over sushi, you, Jim, and I, and said, okay, we just got shot down. Now what? Maybe we should do something a little bit different.
Yeah.
And I think that was kind of like the last straw in trying to merge, right?
Well, I think we realized that what Home RF was doing was actually good in many ways. It was a organization of companies rather than a bunch of engineers just getting together. And those companies had commercial interests, and they wanted to see it succeed, and they wanted to put resources behind something in order to get it succeed. And I think we realized, some kind of a sister organization of the IEEE Standards Committee that focuses on those aspects of this technology that IEEE didn't deal with, like interoperability testing.
Right.
Really made a lot of sense.
Yeah, no, I think that was the genesis for forming, and what would later become the Wi-Fi Alliance was, we had, two charters, right? One is, let's establish multi-vendor interoperability, right? We're just, that's the, if anything, the reason for being, right? It's like, that's, as people may or may not know, just because you build to the standard, that doesn't necessarily guarantee interoperability. It might seem like it does, but if company A says, I built my very complex, thick, standard-based product on IEEE 802.11b, and another vendor says, well, I built my product to IEEE 802.11b, and then they ship them both to a customer and it doesn't work together, whose fault is it, right? You get into that problem, right? You get a lot of finger pointing. And so solving true compatibility and interoperability is a really important goal,
And so I think, the way that the Wi-Fi Alliance then started here, I guess the first thing we did was come up with a name. It was going to be the Wireless Ethernet Compatibility Alliance.
That's right.
Because we didn't have the name Wi-Fi yet.
That's right.
And we were trying to come up with, we were viewing 802.11b running at 11 megabits as the wireless equivalent of Ethernet. So that's the Wireless Ethernet Compatibility Alliance. But actually, you might recall all this, that 3Com had a project to develop a product line around that, and they contracted much of the development out to Symbol Technologies.
That's right. Yeah.
And the chip that the Symbol Technologies implementation was going to be actually based on was the Harris Semiconductor chip. And so, I was consulting both for 3Com and for Symbol at the time.
Right. That's interesting.
I think there was an agreement between you guys
there was.
that. And so it really ended up initially being 3Com, Symbol, and Harris getting together. That's, like at the sushi meal, you, me, and Jim.
Right.
Talking about forming this organization to do interoperability certifications, and that was the start of WECA. And then subsequently, we ended up inviting
Aeronet.
Aeronet, which later got bought by Cisco.
Yeah.
and Lucent, which was the successor organization to the NCR guys who had done all that early work that I talked about before.
That's right.
And then Nokia.
Yeah, it came in kind of at the end, right before we launched. I think Nokia joined in as a customer of Harris. I think it was.
Well, Nokia had a development group in Cambridge, England.
Yeah.
Just a small little development group doing local area network development. They had been active in the IEEE standards, so we knew those guys. I mean, we didn't know people at the at the Helsinki headquarters, but we knew the Cambridge, England guys, and we thought that would be really great to get Nokia in, and it was. They've been.
No, that was the genesis for forming the Wireless Ethernet Compatibility Alliance.
Right.
And again, we didn't have the name Wi-Fi yet. That was actually a project of the Wireless Ethernet Compatibility Alliance later to come up with a name. And I think that was part of it too, as like you said, Greg. It wasn't meant to emulate the IEEE as a group of individual engineers working on a technical standard. It was much more about multi-vendor interoperability. It was absolutely, about commercial interest, whereas, like you said earlier, when there was a voting block or something, and it was all supposed to be individual engineers, that's a no-no in IEEE. In WECA, it was, no, these are companies with commercial interest. They want to commercialize their product. And the joint belief, even though some of these companies that we mentioned are competitors, is that the market would be bigger if it were all interoperable. And so let's fight over a larger piece of pie rather than a smaller piece of pie. Yeah. And I think there's definitely a commercial marketing and business interest, as it was driving a lot of it. To try to get the technology to go from these vertical applications that you mentioned earlier to something that's much more mainstream. And we all had a strong belief that interoperability was going to be key to achieving that.
Yeah. So, but the first thing we needed to do was come up with a name.
Yeah.
Because the standard at the time was called 802.11b high rate.
Right.
And
IEEE 802.11b high rate.
Right, and that wasn't going to fly in the market. So.
I remember these discussions, yeah.
Could you talk, sorry.
Sure.
What year, so I know your 99 was the sushi meal?
Yeah,
that's right.
This is 99.
Yeah. So this is all
1999.
within a few weeks or months after.
Yeah, a few months, I'd say. And then there was another, I think, aspect to it that it'd be fair to mention as the history. It was the sushi meal where we realized that we were never going to merge with HomeRF. And then either shortly before or after that, I also had a conversation with my boss at the time at 3Com, Jeff Abramowitz, who was also instrumental in this whole history. Just a conversation saying, we have to form an organization, and we need to reach out to some of these other key players and do that. And he kind of put me in charge of being the 3Com guy.
Yeah, well, so you were an original board member,
right.
and I, as a consultant and not working for any of the board companies, it was figured that, okay, the way we'll have Greg fit in here is we'll make him technical director. And so I was kind of like the only, I wasn't an employee at the, but I was not a board member, but in charge of the technical work leading up to the actual interoperability certifications.
Yeah, and that was a huge part of it is we didn't want to be IEEE. At the same time, we didn't want to be just another PR announcement and marketing announcement that like, hey, we're here, we're doing wireless LAN. I think there was also, there's kind of, I think, a nice synergy, even from the very beginning, that we have some real technical meat, right? We're really solving a technical problem. We're not writing a standard, but we're adopting the standard and solving interoperability, while at the same time, we're also, a voice to promote it. Wireless LAN 802.11 has a home, it has a voice. You can talk to somebody about it if you're the press or you're an analyst or something like that. You want to learn more about it. It now has a home rather than go download this, join IEEE and go download a spec. Right. And I think promoting it was really key. So yeah, this all formed in. All this work was going on in early 1999. Yeah. And I think I remember all that leading up to our public announcement.
So do you remember some of the alternate names that were?
I get asked that question a lot, and I feel really bad that I do a bad job of answering it. So I'm gonna hope that you're gonna help me remember.
Oh,
because I remember presenting Wi-Fi to the board, and thinking that it wouldn't fly, but it did, and I was very happy. But I can't remember all the alternatives.
So the Wi-Fi Alliance several years ago had its 10-year anniversary. So it must have been in 2009, we had our 10-year anniversary. And so I actually gave a presentation, I'll have to show you this.
Oh, please.
That on the 10-year anniversary. And what I did was I did the whole presentation at the beginning, pretending that we hadn't selected the name Wi-Fi,
That's
but
brilliant.
instead we had selected the other names. And so I put up these logos with the standard Wi-Fi logo, but with these other names up there rather than Wi-Fi. And of course, most of the people in the audience, you know, they were very confused about what was going on here. But so I can name, you know,
Please.
Dragonfly,
Oh yes, Dragonfly. I remember that.
Torchlight,
I do remember that.
Connect, K-I-N-E-C-T, Elevate.
Elevate.
So remember, it was
Yeah.
802.11
Yeah.
at 11 megabits per second. So
Elevate.
hence Elevate.
Yeah. So it's a little too cute, right?
Right.
Well, I remember one board member had a suggestion. Maybe I should mention his name, but I think I will. But somebody said we should call it flank speed.
Flank speed.
Yeah,
That's
that
right.
that one I remember.
Right.
And then someone
was
said,
Jim.
that sounds like flank steak.
Yeah,
You know?
right.
That was
one,
Jim.
That one didn't fly.
That one didn't fly.
Well, none of them flew except for Wi-Fi.
That's right.
And so Wi-Fi, of course, it was a play on words of hi-fi.
Right. Total plan.
Of course, nobody talks about hi-fi now, but back in '99, hi-fi was still a term that,
Yeah.
you know, high fidelity. And so, you know, we figured we needed to say wireless fidelity, although it really meant nothing.
Yeah.
And we very quickly abandoned the wireless fidelity and just went with
Yeah,
Wi-Fi.
yeah, right. My recollection is it was kind of a win either way. We thought, you know, first of all, Wi-Fi, we thought, as a play off of hi-fi, would be catchy, easy to remember, and be much easier to remember, of course, than you know, again, even knowing that it's pronounced IEEE 802.11, you have to be on the inside. To the outsider would be the symbols of IEEE 802.11, you know, just this absolute mess of a name. And that Wi-Fi, even if you didn't know what it meant, it certainly would be catchier. And then you might be able to guess that it had something to do with wireless, because it had Y, and you know, it would just be catchy. And then if they really knew that it actually stood for wireless fidelity, hey, all the better, you know. But it wasn't really, to your point, dependent on that. And then later that was kind of dropped. It was originally, remember the tagline was Wi-Fi, the standard for wireless fidelity. I still have shirts that have that. But then we dropped that later on.
So
It wasn't necessary.
when we got the proposed names put in front of us by this branding company that we had hired to help us through this process, and I remember that they were all presented, and then we were all to go home and think about it before we came back to make a decision. And so I remember I went home, and my daughters were young then. I think they were probably I don't know, 5 and 11 or so. I'd have to figure out how old they were. But I remember sitting down with my daughters and just saying, so what do you think of these names? And you know, Dragonfly. And I remember they liked Wi-Fi. They didn't know why, but they liked. I think we all reacted to it that way.
That's right.
But so I like to say that my two daughters had a hand in that name.
Picking the name. That's great. Yeah, no, I remember it well. I remember, the naming company gave us a big list, and I think I was, if I recall correctly, you know, one of the responsible for presenting it to the board. And I really, for some reason, I thought that I like, you know, Wi-Fi, but I figured it just wouldn't fly. You know, I thought it might be too esoteric, but you know, everybody gravitated to it right away, you know, after we went home and thought about it a little bit.
Yeah.
I think that was an much easier conversation to settle on the name
Yeah.
than you might have thought, you know.
So the board at that time, I mean, it was, I mean,
A small group.
you were on the board,
Yeah.
and then Jim Ziron,
Yep.
who we've talked about.
Right.
Oh, and sorry, give a little background on him. He was sort of the third.
Sure. Jim was Greg Ennis, but he was worked for Harris Semiconductor, which later spun off as Intersil in wireless LAN semiconductors. So he is, you know, IEEE member, very technical guy, a lot of radio design background, and you know, was their standards body guy also that went to a lot of the IEEE meetings and was trying to, you know, work out the 802.11 standard. So you can add a little more to Jim that I didn't cover it. But
Well, I still see him occasionally. His company that he ended up working for got bought by Qualcomm, and
That's right. Yeah, and I talk to Jim occasionally too. And I have to give credit to Jim because when I was brand new at 3Com without any wireless background, it was actually at one of the earlier Home RF meetings, not the one that we finally decided they weren't going to do anything with us and we went to sushi, but an earlier one. Jim and I were talking, and I was still brand new to 3Com, and he did an amazing job of just explaining some basics of wireless. And I remember this conversation because it was a very weird setting, because the Home RF meeting itself at that time, it was like adjacent to this big like horse barn. And so we were having this conversation about the basics of radio, literally like sitting in this barn, it's like a break in the meeting, but he's explaining some very basics of wireless. So I still owe him to this day for kind of patiently explaining some of the very basics of radio modulation to a newbie in the industry. So it's a lot of credit.
And then also on the board was Phil Bellinger, who we talked about earlier, because he, along with Wim Diepstraten and myself, we were the trio who put together the proposal back in 1993, the DFW MAC proposal, right? Yeah. So I had been working with Phil all those years, and he had since gone off to work for Aeronet, which was a spin-off from Telzon, actually.
Oh, okay.
But they, right when we were forming the Wi-Fi Alliance, Aeronet got bought by Cisco. So some of our early materials right at that time talk about Aeronet, and then suddenly it starts talking about Cisco.
Yeah, yeah.
But that was Cisco's big entry. Of course, I mean, they've been a major player ever since.
No, that was their entry. They had no, as a big networking company, they had no wireless play until they bought Aeronet in '99. I remember that acquisition.
Right.
Acquisition well.
And then there was Angela Champness from Lucent.
That's right.
Who came from that group in Holland that had been originally NCR and then got incorporated into Lucent. And so she came from that group. Yeah. And then there was John Ferrari from Nokia, who had very little wireless LAN background when he came in, but he ended up being totally instrumental in a lot of the early marketing stuff.
Sure, I know, he was a great addition to the board.
Yeah.
We had a good mix of marketing, business, and technical talent on the board, I think, and that kind of, I think everyone got that it wasn't, it was both a technical and a marketing effort, and we were able to kind of get a little traction that way.
So once we picked the name, then the other big task that we had was to really come up with a real interoperability certification program.
That's right, the meat.
And that kind of fell on my shoulders to organize with all of these different companies. And the very first interoperability demonstration of this equipment, of what was to become Wi-Fi equipment, was at our public announcement of Wi-Fi at Networld Interop in Atlanta in September of 1999.
Yep, that's right. And June of '99, just to establish the timeline, we announced that WECA was an organization. I think that was the timeline. That was our press release, like, we're here and this is who we are and this is what we're going to do. And then in September '99 was our first, Atlanta Networld Interop was we lifted the veil and said,
it's going to be called Wi-Fi.
It's going to be called, that was two things. Yeah, we lifted the veil and we told the world that the name would be Wi-Fi. That was officially announced. And that's when we had our first, interoperable equipment demo, I believe.
Right, because I had worked with the guys from the 6 founding companies to develop a demo where we were showing interoperability. And remember this, there were the naysayers out there. The
plenty.
home RF people were saying this will never happen, this stuff is never going to interoperate. And so it really was a major thing that we had to demonstrate.
No, we proved a lot of people wrong, so that this, very complicated technology could actually work in an interoperable manner, And
so what was the demo?
It was just laptops with PC cards plugged in, and from like one from Lucent, and then another laptop with a card from 3Com, and an access point from Symbol, and this different equipment, and just showing that we could transfer data back and forth. Very simple.
The client device, the station device could connect to all the different access points, and the access point could connect to all the different brands of station, client devices, and just simple data packet forwarding. Nothing, too whiz bang. We weren't, running video or anything exotic. It was just you can make a connection. You can actually operate on, this local area network, this wireless local area network among all these vendors.
Yeah, and ensuring interoperability has been the focus of the Wi-Fi Alliance, since the very beginning now. And I think that's a big part of Wi-Fi's success, is that the stuff works. You can take your smartphone to Cairo and connect to that internet cafe.
No, I agree. I think that's to the lay person, it's a small and subtle point, perhaps. But without it, you just would have none of that, right? If you think about it, if you had to know what brand of access point was sitting behind the network and make sure that that matched or was from some compatibility list, know what kind of Wi-Fi device was in your smartphone or your laptop or your iPad or something, and just none of this would have really taken off, right? It's kind of like you said, there's this kind of became a no-brainer that you can just show up and connect, right?
So I guess the third thing that we needed to do, and which we did unveil at that Networld Interop show, was our certification lab, our selected certification lab that was going to do the actual testing. And that was a little company based in Silicon Valley called this
SVNL, Silicon Valley
Networking Lab.
Yep, that's right.
SVNL.
Steve Bell.
Steve Bell. And so I remember, I think you and I were the principal people who negotiated that contract.
That's right. And Steve Bell, worked with him. And
yeah, and so I remember Steve, as we were working up the RFP for this, and he asked, well, how many products are we going to certify?
Yeah.
And because he needed to factor that into how much money is revenue going to be and everything. And so we said, we kind of scratched our heads. 30.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, we've now done
over
14,000 product certifications.
Right. No, but here's the other part of the story. We said 30, and he was like, no way. He's like, you're crazy. It'll probably never be more than 5. He thought we were off our rocker to say 30.
Right.
And, so he really did believe us. We had to kind of prove him over time that, there was a market for this, and that there actually were going to be companies coming in with their devices, because he was calculating, okay, 2 from Symbol, 2 from 3Com, whatever. You got 5 board members, You'd be lucky if you break 10.
But other companies started joining up right at the beginning. I mean, it's been a ramp, and it's still, I mean, it's continuing. There's, like 500 member companies now in the Wi-Fi line.
I think that's a really key point. I think it really did catch fire in the sense that once we kind of had this demo and showed interoperability, it wasn't that, whatever, we were being interviewed by, major news networks the next day, but I think there was, a lot of companies that were interested in wireless LAN on the sideline and started to move off the sideline and said, okay, this looks like something interesting is happening. Of course they knew, they had the 802.11 standard 97 finally got done, the 99 extension for 11B, and now you have this organization that's actually going to stand behind interoperability. I think, in the period of, 99 through 01, 02, whatever, and, like I said, it still continued, but it's certainly in that first year or two, we saw a lot of companies come off the sidelines and start to join and say this is for real. Companies like Apple and companies like Microsoft.
Yeah, Dell was a very early
big major companies, influential.
And ultimately, the Intel, who had been one of the main companies behind Home RF, they ended up joining the Wi-Fi Alliance.
I know, that was a big moment.
We felt that was a big moment.
It was.
When was that?
What's that?
When was that?
That was, I know exactly when that was, because their representative, Barry Davis, talked to me. And this is the meeting that was in the Netherlands. I think this meeting was actually in
so that was probably about 2001.
Amsterdam. Yeah, I think it was 2001.
Yeah.
And I think the meeting was in Amsterdam. And I remember their representative, Barry Davis, saying, because he'd been coming to the meetings as an observer, just to see what's going on. And he finally said, I think we're going to join the Wi-Fi Alliance officially and drop the Home RF effort. And he kind of checked with me and said, I hope you guys aren't going to dance around in celebration or kind of rub our nose in it, or anything, and put out some announcement Intel finally does the right thing or something. I mean, he's really concerned about the PR aspect of it. I got a good laugh out of it. This conversation over the hotel bar. I assured him that in no way, we're just glad to have you aboard, and we have no interest in making anybody feel bad. We're just glad they finally joined the kind of the open standard. And that was really the thing too, is that Wi-Fi wasn't just somebody else's proprietary push. It was based on the open standard. So we had a lot of that going for us too. So, but you're right. When Intel joined, that was also a big moment. Then you had virtually every major player by that point. Cisco, Intel, Microsoft, Apple, 3Com, you name it. So all the semiconductor players.
Speaking of Apple, so that was a major milestone in the Wi-Fi story also.
Sure.
Was when Apple announced that they were incorporating Wi-Fi into their products, but not only that, but they were incorporating it into their into their laptops at a $99 price point.
Mm-hmm.
And up until that point, nobody thought you could build
Right.
a Wi-Fi device and break that $100
Right.
barrier.
Yeah, that's right.
And
That's
so
huge.
that was a huge additional step that made everybody out there suddenly realize, oh, the cost of this technology is coming down, and it probably will continue to come
That's
down.
right. That really validated Wi-Fi in a big way because the other, like you said, 802.11 had a lot of knocks. One of them was it was too complicated. It's never going to be interoperable, and the other one was going to be too expensive, right? And in a sense, that was part of HomeRF's reason for being is we're focused on the consumer. It's going to be cheap. It's going to be consumer friendly. Then all of a sudden, Apple comes out, has a Wi-Fi 802.11b $99 device, and it's like, whoa! It's now not expensive. It's interoperable. It's everything that the naysayers said it wasn't. And we really disproved all the negatives, and it was definitely a major milestone,
Yeah.
I think, and that caused a lot of also computer manufacturers, notebook manufacturers to take notice. Like I said, it was going to be, was it the iBook at the time or whatever it was? You can add a $99 card to it. All of a sudden, Dell and HP and all these other notebook vendors really started to take notice and started on the path towards first offering NIC cards and later embedding Wi-Fi right
Yeah.
into the notebook.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about the Wi-Fi Alliance as an organization? I mean,
Sure.
what were you officially? What was your revenue model with the
Sure.
companies? How many employees?
So the Wi-Fi Alliance is it's a nonprofit organization. It's an alliance of the individual companies. There are a set of companies who are sponsor companies, who by virtue of being sponsor companies, they have the privilege of designating representatives on the board of directors. Today there are 16 sponsor companies. And I better not start to name them because I'll probably forget some of them. But it's all the major players, that you would anticipate. And there's like 500 member companies, and the revenue stream supporting the activities of the organization initially came completely from membership fees. The member companies pay a certain amount per year.
Roughly how much?
Well, the beginning of the sponsor companies, and part of it was, one of the original reasons for sponsor level companies and regular member companies, we knew that not everybody would put up this big fee. And it was a big fee. I think it was like $100K.
Yeah.
When we originally founded the Wi-Fi, we needed some starting money, right?
For the sponsors.
Yeah, for the sponsors, right?
Right.
So the sponsors each put up like $100K per year to fund the organization and get it going, and then the regular members, I don't remember the original fee, but much less, like something on the order of 10K or something, like
Yeah.
15K. Big
Right.
difference. And Greg's point, the revenue model wasn't. You might think, they probably charged some amount per certification, but that wasn't the model at all. It was just really sponsor member fees and regular member fees. And then the money, at least initially, went to Steve Bell's, SVNL lab, and the one that he thought that he'd get, no more than 6 certifications, right?
Yeah.
In the very beginning.
Yeah, and it went to pay for me. I mean,
Yeah,
I was,
right.
I was
Because you're one
the paid
consultant.
worker here.
Although I think technically, and Greg, please correct me if I'm wrong about this memory, just to get the record straight. I think technically you were still being paid by symbol, not by WECA.
The
right?
initial.
I don't think WECA wrote you a check.
Right.
In other words.
Well,
not then.
Not right at the beginning.
That's what I mean.
You're
That's
absolutely right that
right.
that actually Nokia financed separately the marketing activities, and Symbol financed separately the technical activities, which was
Right.
really the work that I was doing.
Right.
But then it wasn't even a year before we transitioned that, and
Right.
then I had
Then we had a marketing director and a
direct work.
technical director that were
Right.
funded by WECA.
Well, funded by WECA, that's
Yeah.
right. Right. I will say that some of the revenues for the Wi-Fi Alliance now does come from certification activities.
Okay.
So it's a mixed revenue model, and there's a lot of stuff going on. I mean, it finances a fair amount. And that's because the technology keeps on advancing.
Sure.
I think when we first started WECA, the Wi-Fi Alliance, maybe you had a clearer vision, but it wasn't clear to me what this organization was going to be doing, 3 or 4 years from now. But what ended up happening was that the technology continued to advance,
Right.
and there continued to come new amendments to the base standard within the IEEE standards activities for higher data rates, for the
Different frequency
to
bands.
operate in different frequency bands.
Yep.
Then later on, there was stuff for quality of service enhancements to support multimedia applications.
Security, which
security.
is an enormous topic. you
Right.
know.
And so all of this ended up just getting folded right into the Wi-Fi Alliance activities to develop certification programs, not just for the base standard, but
Right.
for these additional extensions to the standard in these various areas. And you know, now there's, you know, I'd say there's today, you know, probably about 20 different activities going on within the Wi-Fi Alliance, leading towards you know,
Certification.
the launch of potentially new certification programs that would be
20 new
additional ones. Yeah,
Yeah,
and
wow.
there's just a tremendous amount of activity going on in all sorts of areas. We keep on launching new programs for higher data rates, or for voice support, or for you know, supporting, you know, sharing of displays using Wi-Fi, getting into all sorts of application areas actually.
Yeah, yeah, no, that certainly we never envisioned it would get, you know, that to that level of complexity when we started. We just wanted to make 802.11b, you know, successful. But it was a natural step, at least early on, when we, you know, when companies, like early companies like Atheros wanted to do 802.11a, which is in a different frequency band of 5 gigahertz, and they came to the Wi-Fi Alliance and said, you know, can we do certification around that as well? And the you know, after some limited debate, I think the answer was pretty quickly yes. You know, the alternative being to have some other organization start up and do certifications around a different 802.11 technology. I think we decided, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, I think we decided pretty quickly that it'd be better to have that under the, you know, under the WECA, at the still called at that time the WECA, you know, later the Wi-Fi Alliance umbrella. Right. So then we took on 11A, and then when 11G came out, that was at that point that was kind of obvious that the Wi-Fi Alliance would back that as well.
Yeah. So I think another one of the real major factors here in the success story for Wi-Fi has been the complete adoption of Wi-Fi by the traditional cellular industry. And that was not necessarily a real easy hurdle.
Yeah.
You know, as smartphones began to come out, and companies such as Nokia was very instrumental early on in this, but others as well, saw that smartphone functionality could benefit not just from having a cellular radio in the device, but from having a Wi-Fi radio in the device for Wi-Fi applications. That introduced some real complications and challenges. I mean, one was that all of our certification techniques were oriented towards basically certifying PC
PCs
type
in a
products.
Windows environment or things like that, yeah.
And so the Wi-Fi Alliance had to take on a whole new set of test tools and test environment just to be able to certify these you know, handheld devices.
Yeah.
But then also there was a whole issue of having two radios implemented, you know, a cellular and a Wi-Fi radio implemented right next to each other within a single device, where even if they're operating on different frequency channels, because they're so close to each other, they can be interfering with each other.
Yeah,
and so that led to a whole effort where we worked jointly with CTIA, the Cellular Telecommunications Industry Association, to develop a joint certification that would make sure that when Wi-Fi is implemented in smartphones, that it really works well with the cellular radio that's also implemented there. And that really brought in the whole operator universe into the Wi-Fi Alliance, and ultimately was very successful. I mean, now you can't buy a smartphone without Wi-Fi.
Yeah, but there was a time where you're right. Initially, early in the smartphones, a lot of the providers were really kind of anti-Wi-Fi. They viewed it as like, oh, it's a competitor to my service. I want to sell my whatever at the time, 2.5G, 3G, service, and I don't really want Wi-Fi in my device. There was some kind of pushback early on, if I recall. There was really some, demand for Wi-Fi, but not necessarily carriers agreeing to do it. But that certainly has changed dramatically in the last few years.
I think the iPhone was a big part of that, because when the iPhone came out with Wi-Fi, and the 3G cellular service, with kind of this unified access to the internet, whether you're on Wi-Fi or on 3G, and people fell in love with the data application so much that the cellular networks, the 3G networks, couldn't handle the demand that the iPhone users had for all of this bandwidth. And so Wi-Fi suddenly became something that it's not just this, kind of interesting little adjunct, but it suddenly became a critical component of the smartphone, because there's no way that the 3G network could satisfy, could really handle the applications that people wanted to do with that. And so Wi-Fi became the preferred way of doing that.
Yeah, it went from being something that the carriers didn't want to almost being a savior technology. Yeah, because of their bandwidth, it got totally overloaded. Yeah, especially as you say, as data apps took off and people stopped using their cell phones just for talking and went to everything texting and other data apps, Facebook posting, all this kind of stuff. Then the carriers got dramatically overloaded. And the iPhone, you have thousands and thousands of applications, many of them data oriented that want a network connection. I think you're absolutely right. I think Wi-Fi has played a tremendous role in helping carriers to roll that out in a way that doesn't bring down their whole network. I mean, they're still struggling with not enough capacity for data applications, and thinking about how they can move more stuff to Wi-Fi rather than less.
So what's interesting there is that there are advances in the cellular technology to give increasing data rates, over the years. But there's also advances in data rate within Wi-Fi technology. I mean, we've gone from the 2 megabits per second of the original 1997 standard to the 11 megabits per second of the original Wi-Fi, then 54 megabits per second for 802.11g, and then up to over hundreds of megabits per second for 802.11n. And now there's new things coming out of the IEEE standards that will come out over the next couple of years that will support over gigabit rates. So the thing that's interesting is that, the cellular data rates may increase, but so does the Wi-Fi data rates. And the cellular rates are never going to catch up to the Wi-Fi rates. At any snapshot in time, you're always going to have much more performance out of the Wi-Fi part of your device than out of your cellular part of your device. And so consequently, people will use that, and there will always be a demand for the highest performance. So even as the cellular technology improves, Wi-Fi is still going to be the higher performing, I would say preferred alternative for certainly for the high performance applications.
Now if we can only get kind of local broadband to keep up a little bit better, your DSL and cable and all that, but but you're right, the Wi-Fi is evolving extremely quickly. To think about in the forthcoming 802.11ac standard, talking about so many variants and options, but you're talking about many of those link rates at well over a gigabit per second. That's pretty amazing. To think about, we just had gigabit Ethernet not too long ago as a breakthrough, and now we're doing gigabit plus Wi-Fi soon to come. So that's pretty wild.
So from the early years, like 2001, when it really was clear that you were growing and solidified, what were the main kind of stages between then and now?
Well, I could talk from my perspective of the certification program.
From yours and from the Wi-Fi Alliance.
So one of the this is kind of an operational transition that ended up having a big impact. When we started the Wi-Fi Alliance, we were working with this little company. They subsequently were bought by Agilent, and they continued to serve as a certification lab for the Wi-Fi Alliance. But very quickly, we swamped their capacity to be able to certify products, number one. But number two, the industry took off in a huge way in Asia, in particular in Taiwan, but also in Japan, Korea, and now in China in a very big way. And so as the Wi-Fi Alliance grew in its membership and ended up with a very global membership. In fact, now it's half of the member companies are Asian companies, and then the other half would be North American and European. And we needed to support certifications local to where those companies were developing their products. So we changed our model from having a single lab doing certifications to having multiple labs. And I mean, this was one of the projects that I did was kind of a grand tour of the world, looking at potential lab partners that we could contract with to take on Wi-Fi certifications. And we now have a network of 17 labs worldwide that do Wi-Fi certifications. We have a lab in India, we've got multiple labs in China, we've got multiple labs in Taiwan, we've got a lab in Spain, a lab in Germany, multiple labs in the United States. And that just was absolutely necessary operationally just to handle the volume of products that was coming on. So
yeah, and I think the operational model changed too from,
what year, rough? I mean,
Sorry.
when did you do the grand tour?
That's a good question. That's
roughly
probably around 2002.
So early, wow. Okay.
Yeah, fairly early, because I'm thinking .11g came out in 2003,
Yeah.
and we had the labs in Taiwan in place at that time. So.
And at some point, the operational model changed from the Wi-Fi Alliance, having a single lab to actually labs could come and get certified by the Wi-Fi. Or you tell me what the right method was, but labs could kind of come in and apply to be right.
Yeah, essentially, we still don't let just any lab do
Right.
Wi-Fi certifications.
Yeah.
I mean, there are
Has to be
other
validated by the
organizations that
labs.
have certification programs where it's kind of a free-for-all where labs can sign up to do certifications. But we've always had the approach of maintaining some level of control over the labs that actually do certification. I think that's
a key part of keeping the quality up and making sure that although you lose interoperability, you lose the whole thing.
Right. But we should probably say, when we talk about these certification programs, those get developed within the Wi-Fi Alliance, and it basically is a test plan that identifies a set of devices that are used to verify that other devices can be interoperable with them. And it's a tremendous amount of effort that actually is primarily the volunteer effort from the member companies within the Wi-Fi Alliance, who form committees within the Wi-Fi Alliance to develop this. And then there's a Wi-Fi Alliance technical staff who ends up implementing what gets developed as into a real operational test environment and rolls that out to these 17 labs worldwide. So there's a tremendous effort that gets contributed from all the member companies in developing all of these programs. And that was the model at the beginning, and it continues to be the model today.
Yeah, so any member company can join with other member companies to form a committee, right? And if they're interested in a particular kind of certification, right, they can join together and say, hey, we're interested, there's a process and it has to be board approved and all this stuff.
Yeah.
But if there's a need for a certain type of certification, like the example you gave earlier where you have smartphones and you needed to actually have joint cooperation from CTIA, there's kind of a method for being able to do that.
Right.
And other specific certifications. There's voice certifications, and what are some of the other examples of certifications that have been done recently?
There's what we call the ease of use certifications,
Sure.
which has to do with being able to, it's essentially user interface um, conventions that products can get certified against to make sure that networks can be set up very easily by uneducated users. There are certifications that are specific to support applications like video and other multimedia applications that where the bandwidth needs to be handled in a prioritized way to make sure that the higher priority traffic is being dealt with properly.
Yes, quality of service certification.
Quality of service,
Yeah.
that's right.
In Wi-Fi speak, it's Wi-Fi multimedia, right? So
That's right.
right. So
Right.
I think it might also be good to explain that when you think about how many certifications are done a year, thousands of certifications a year, right? And you're up to 14 Wi-Fi lines. We're up to
I think it's about 3,000 a year.
yeah.
we're
That's
doing
a lot. And people think about it. They might think, well, when you bring a product in for certification, do you have to, make sure that it's interoperable with 3,000 other devices? How does that actually work? Well, I know the answer, but
Yeah.
it's good. I think it's good to explain how the certification philosophy work. How do you prove
Right.
that it's interoperable?
So yeah, and actually the model that we have here has been replicated by other organizations in other technologies. So I mean, a lot of people look upon what we do here as really the right model, and it involves a series of, although it's wireless, we still call them plug fests. Maybe we should say unplug fests.
Yeah.
But it's relatively formal get-togethers on the part of the manufacturers of equipment prior to any certification. In fact, often prior to even the finalization of the relevant standard in this particular certification program, where the companies get together and they determine whether or not they can interoperate. They do tests and they do all sorts of examinations to make sure that they're interpreting the specification correctly. Very much like what we did at the very first interoperability demo back in Atlanta in 1999, of getting the companies together and making them play well together. And there's a whole series of these events that are managed by the Wi-Fi Alliance, and most of them are held at our Wi-Fi Alliance lab, which is in Santa Clara. While we're allowing companies to test out their products against each other, we're also simultaneously developing a test plan to actually ultimately certify that. And at the end of the process, a set of devices is selected to form the core test bed that will end up getting replicated to all of the labs worldwide, and those form the core devices against which interoperability is checked. And we always, we have, like at least 5 independent implementations, and very often, I'll say this: the companies who very heavily participate in this part of the development of the Wi-Fi certification programs are actually the semiconductor companies who are producing the Wi-Fi chipsets, and it ends up very commonly being their reference designs that are full implementations of a real product, but it's a reference design showing people how they can build a fully featured Wi-Fi product using a particular chipset. Those products very heavily participate in the PlugFest series, and commonly end up even within the test beds, and consequently, the interoperability that's assured for that particular chipset reference design ends up carrying on in all of the customers to that chip company, who then go on to implement their own products using that chipset. Of course, those companies still need to certify their products, but there's been a head start that they've gotten because they know that the fundamental chipset has already gone through this process.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. By having the semiconductor companies so active, and that's okay. I think to mention the names. It's who are some of the most active players on that.
It's Broadcom, it's Qualcomm, Atheros, it's Intel, it's Raylink, it's
those, I mean, that's at the risk of leaving out
Marvell,
one or two. Marvell, and it won't be the same one for every certification program, but a lot of the same players show up, and I think, yeah, that's it's a good way of going and explaining how interoperability works. And if you can get those basic reference designs interoperable, Broadcom's reference design access point works with Qualcomm Atheros' reference design station device and on, and then all these other OEMs essentially build off those reference designs. Well, you've got a really great head start for interoperability. The other thing I thought might be people want to know is that when a product comes in for interoperability testing, they're not literally testing against the existing 3,000 products that year or 14,000 products over the history of Wi-Fi. That would obviously take forever and be infeasible. They're coming and test against that reference design test bed, or whatever's in the test bed, typically reference design. And it's kind of proxy interoperability, right? So if you come in as a station device and you're interoperable with these 4 or 5 access point designs, then by proxy you'll be interoperable as you go out there in the real world.
Right, and that's why it's important.
It's a small logical leap, but in reality, it seems like it's actually worked very well.
It's worked tremendously well, and that's why it's important that the devices that do go into the test beds are truly independent designs.
Right.
And if you can work with 5 different independently designed implementations, then you're very likely going to interoperate properly with other equipment that similarly interoperates with all those 5 different independent implementations. It's proved to be a model that is very effective and has really stood the test.
When you talk about a test bed, this is every time there's an update to the standard. Or how often do you create one of these reference sets?
So we launch probably something on the order of 5 new certification programs each year. And so each one of those new certification programs will be covering some new aspect of either the IEEE standards, or it could be a specification that actually gets developed within the Wi-Fi Alliance. For example, Wi-Fi Direct, which is a peer-to-peer technology to allow direct data sharing among devices without needing to go through a hotspot or be connected to the internet at all. That's a mode of operation for Wi-Fi devices that actually got specified and developed within the Wi-Fi Alliance, not within IEEE. But so that's an example of a certification program that we launched a couple of years ago. And then there, like I said, every year there's approximately 5 new certification programs that have to do with either some new core technology standard or some new application that we end up now allowing people to certify their devices for interoperability on.
I think that was also a big milestone. You alluded to that briefly about in the history of the Wi-Fi Alliance. Initially, we're certifying based on IEEE 802.11 standards. And then, my recollection, it was security that we first broke that model.
Right.
Because there's such an urgent need that we actually developed, what became the, WPA Wi-Fi Protected Access. In that case, it was kind of before the standard, the actual 802.11, in that case, 802.11i standard was ready just for the urgency. But I think that set the model later for doing things that were completely independent from 802.11, for everything from Wi-Fi Protected Setup to now Wi-Fi Direct.
Right. Another good example is with 802.11n, which, right now, .11n is the highest data rate version of Wi-Fi, and it's implemented in all the retail devices that you're gonna purchase these days. But when that version of the IEEE specification was going through the process within the standards committee and being finalized, it was going through a process of draft standards and balloting and various conversations about one technical solution or another on some minor point of the evolving standard. And what was happening was that companies were starting to come out with products that were based upon an unapproved draft standard and calling them 802.11n. And there was a real worry within the industry that these products were not going to be interoperable and that was going to give the whole Wi-Fi industry a black eye, and was going to sour people on the interoperability promise that Wi-Fi has always offered to people. And so the Wi-Fi Alliance decided to actually start its certification program in advance of the finalization of the standard by identifying a particular draft specification and saying, we're going to certify to this draft specification. And that was a year in advance of the ultimate 802.11n ratification in IEEE, but it turned out that there were only negligible differences between the ultimate standard and what we started to certify on.
Yeah.
And that ended up giving a huge kickstart to the whole .11n market.
Yeah, and I think it's a great example of the Wi-Fi Alliance being flexible and realizing, again, the market need, right? It's not a standards body where you have to always follow the exact same rules, but if it's in the best interest of the industry, the best interest of commercialization, the best interest of the end user experience, and not breaking the promise of interoperability, sure, we can do that. We can do, and I think it was what Draft 2.0 that was adopted as the interoperability program at first, and then later, it was just the final 11n standard, and it really at that point, like you said, was really no big deal to go from the draft standard to the final standard, and you had a smooth transition. You had interoperable devices, good user experience versus the alternative to have, the mess that you alluded to that probably would have happened with a bunch of devices out there not interoperable, and then waiting for the final standard. And I think from my recollection, even from the very early on, there was a spirit in WECA and the Wi-Fi Alliance that, we're not held to some official, rule book. You want to operate fairly to all the members, but there was a nimbleness, I think, built inside WECA and the Wi-Fi Alliance that, we could react to these market forces and to the interest in the members and the interest of growing the market and solving real problems, where it was, we wouldn't be tied down by, an IEEE charter or PAR or Robert's Rules of Order or whatever you have. It was kind of as the Wi-Fi Alliance grows really big, that may be harder to do all the time. But I think, even your recent example proves that there's still kind of a philosophy from the very beginning of, we're here to solve problems, we're here to grow the market, we're here to serve our members, we're here to ensure a good end user experience, and we'll do what we have to do to get that done. So I think that's stayed throughout.
Yeah. So I think another thing that, in thinking about the key transition points in the evolution of the Wi-Fi Alliance was that, originally it was just the board of directors and me, basically. And we decided, as we grew in members, that it was time to bring on, a real organization.
Right.
And we hired Frank Hanslick to be the first managing director.
Right, actual paid staff.
Actual paid staff with an actual Wi-Fi Alliance office. Besides my home office. And and Frank, led the organization for some very critical years through the .11g, and he brought on a tremendous staff, including Edgar Figueroa, who is the CEO of the organization now. Right. I mean, Edgar started on the technical operations side, so he's now the CEO of the organization. So that was certainly a major. Of course, every organization goes through that from its startup phase to professional management.
No, you're right. Because in the beginning it was all, we had the board, which was all volunteer run. Well, you as a consultant, but all volunteer run, and that was. It was a burden on everybody. It was needed, and we're glad we did it. But at a certain point, it was like, hey, it's time to actually hire some people to run this shop.
And what is your relationship like with the relevant parts of the IEEE, the 802 group?
So we are. I think we would be referred to as the certification authority for the IEEE 802.11 family of standards. There's nothing formalized there. It's not like there's some higher level body that has designated the Wi-Fi Alliance as.
There's no signed agreement, as far as I know.
It's just simply the way that it is. I mean, nobody would question that. So it's a, to some extent, it's sister organizations, In practice, many of the same individuals participate in IEEE as they participate within the Wi-Fi Alliance. Within the Wi-Fi Alliance, as we mentioned before, it's an organization of member companies. So when people are participating within the Wi-Fi Alliance, they're clearly representing their company's interests, and voting is by company, for example. Whereas when they're participating in the IEEE committees, they're there as an individual engineer, and voting is by individual without company affiliations. But nonetheless, it's a lot of the same people are participating in both, and so there's a lot of very good cross-fertilization. So, for example, when a specification is being developed within the IEEE for some new extension to the standard, part of the feedback that goes into that process comes from the plug fests that the Wi-Fi Alliance is hosting for early prototype implementations of this draft standard, and then those people recognize, you interpreted that line of the specification in this way, and I interpreted it this way. We need to get that clarified in the spec, and that'll end up going back to the IEEE specification. So it's a very close relationship, but there's actually nothing formal.
So I think we talked about a lot of the different aspects. Maybe just can you pontificate a little bit on the future of, from your perspective as technical director all these years, the future of the Wi-Fi Alliance? What's the Wi-Fi Alliance going to be like in 2014, 2018, 2020?
Well, I can tell you that we just signed a lease with, I think, a 7-year commitment on lab space that is 4 times the size of our existing lab here in Santa Clara. And so clearly we're all anticipating tremendous continued growth.
Sure.
And it's not just in the numbers of devices that get sold, but it's in the diversity of devices. Mm-hmm. Basically, Wi-Fi has become the default common language that all high-tech devices use to communicate with each other. I mean, you think of it, you've got a cell phone, and you've got, so there's other, you've got a cellular radio in there, but you also have Wi-Fi.
Right.
You've got your HD TV, flat screen television, it's got HDMI connecting to it, but it's also got Wi-Fi.
Right.
You've got, your laptop, it's got all sorts of connectors.
Ethernet, but it's got Wi-Fi.
But it's got Wi-Fi.
Yeah.
So, there's all these different communication methods, and they all have their place, and they all solve some kind of a specific problem. But what Wi-Fi has kind of evolved into is the common one mm-hmm. that goes into all of these devices. Mm-hmm. And Wi-Fi long ago passed that knee in the curve of the positive feedback loop. Mm-hmm. I think it's called Metcalfe's law, right? Yeah. That the I'll be misquoting this, but it's something like the utility of a networking standard is proportional to the square of the number of devices that implement it. Well, Wi-Fi, long ago passed the point where the utility is just tremendous for everybody because all these devices have it. So I think that's what that's one of the things that we're going to continue to see is just Wi-Fi going into essentially every device.
Yeah, any device that needs to be connected.
Right, and so this will include sensor networks. Mm-hmm. This will include applications to support smart energy, for mm-hmm. example. Mm-hmm. Appliances in the home. Mm-hmm. All sorts of. We can't envision what the devices are that we're all going to be using 5 years from now, but I'm pretty sure that device is going to have Wi-Fi in it. Yeah. It may be different from the Wi-Fi that we see now, but it will be backwards interoperable with the Wi-Fi that we have now.
That's right. Yeah, and that's been a great promise too, is that it really held to that promise of interoperability. You can even take an old Wi-Fi device and show up into a network, and in all likelihood, if it's Wi-Fi certified, it's still going to work.
Yeah.
which is really quite a promise that's been delivered on.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I agree. Lots and lots of devices, lots of different types of devices, lots of different types of certifications that may aid, depending on the kind of device,
Yeah.
and the application, like you said, whether it's smart energy, voice, video, things like that. Yeah, it'll be. It's been exciting. It'll continue to be an exciting road, I'm sure.
It sure will.
Well, good. Well, thank you, Greg, very much for joining today.
Okay, well, thank you, David.
Sure. Pleasure speaking with you.
My pleasure.